Mr. Jack Houghton, thank you so much for joining me from the UK during this epidemic that we've got going, or pandemic that we've got going on at the moment. I'd be remiss, there's something that I'm very curious about, and I think a lot of people globally are going to be fascinated about the 2020 election this year. Is that something that you'll be playing in? Are you a US electoral bettor? And what are you sort of forecasting, if so?
So my first academic specialism was politics, and I kind of, from that I got into the psychology much more, because they're obviously very closely linked. And I used to be, I used to kind of fancy myself as a really prescient, successful politics punter, and I guess I was really, because I think it tended to be one of those markets where people would overreact. And there was huge value to be found in markets where a slightly more sceptical way of looking at things, which recognised that the market didn't yet know everything. I was able to be very profitable early on. I think the turning point for me with politics came a few years ago now. I forget the exact year, but in the UK, Scotland had a referendum as to whether or not it would remain part of the UK. I wrote a kind of fairly scathing article at the time saying, and I say I fancied myself as this kind of this soothsayer who could see into the future with politics. And I'd sort of made these successful predictions in the past about things. And I wrote this article saying, look, there is absolutely no way in the world Scotland is going to vote to go independent of the UK. It's just nonsense. And I wrote very strongly about it, and I wrote about why that was the case. And I talked about something called status quo bias, this idea that humans will typically always revert to what they know and what they understand rather than going for something new that they don't. Now, the advice was correct, if you like, because Scotland did vote just to remain part of the UK. But when you go back and read the article is absolutely terrible, because all the things that I was so certain about, it turned out it was a very, very, very narrow call, and there was absolutely no basis on which I should have that certainty. Right. Now, all the long rambling preface to say that from that moment, I've been much, much more sceptical about politics. And I think we operate in a world in politics now where I think we all just have to accept that we don't really understand what is happening. Mm-hmm. And I think if there's one realm where people need to beware of experts and beware of people making pronouncements, mm-hmm. I think it's in the world of politics, because I think there is so much stuff that is not in the public domain that we just don't fully know about at the moment. Mm-hmm. Now, we got a glimpse of that in the 2016 election, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Yeah. And how the Republican Party in the US were allegedly using companies like Cambridge Analytica to influence the kind of content that people were being sent on social media platforms. My gut feel is that we don't know the full extent of that kind of practice. Mm-hmm. And I think also it's very easy to be sucked into, to be further sucked into a world that you already inhabit. So that makes no sense whatsoever, so I'll try and explain it. I guess I'm a fairly liberal guy. I live in a country that is on the kind of liberal side of most things when you compare it internationally. Now, I look at what's happening in the States, and I look at it through the lens of someone who comes from a culture that is quite liberal. Now, we have a situation in the UK where even our right-leaning media, I mean, if you think about media outlets like, we've got the Daily Telegraph over here, and slightly less so the Times, they would typically be read by people who would vote Conservative, typically an older audience, much more sort of right of centre political views. Even though papers in this country take a fairly sort of ridiculing approach to their assessment of Donald Trump. It is therefore very easy for me to get sucked into a view that everybody in America must think Donald Trump's an absolute incompetent idiot, and therefore there is absolutely no way he could possibly win the next presidential election. He's probably favourite, would be my...
Yeah. He's $2 and Biden's $2.30, and we're recording this in sort of mid to late April.
Yeah, and I don't know what the media coverage has been like in Australia, but I don't know how you feel about this, but I find that really hard to understand. I mean, this is a guy who's just been through an embarrassing impeachment trial. Every single media report that I ever read ridicules the guy. Every YouTube channel that pops up when I go onto YouTube, has a very negative perspective on Trump. Therefore, I'm sat here thinking, how can that be the case? I mean, is that what you get in Australia as well?
Yeah, the same stuff, and we're probably surrounded by similar thinking people and skepticism, but yeah, to me, it's just a machine that keeps moving forward. And I don't know. I've got an opinion on it. It's not very well researched, but I don't think he's still such an enigma that he attracts all of everything about him. So it's that old adage of there's no such thing as bad plus publicity. That the man is significantly bigger than any other opponent he has, and yeah, I'd be surprised if he's able to ride out the economic climate and this COVID disaster. Then he is bulletproof in my estimation, and that is riddled with assumptions and very minute research. But that's my opinion. But I'm hoping to speak to people like yourself and others that can give me a more well-formed opinion.
Well, I think the opinion is well-formed, and I think it's well-formed because you recognise within it just how difficult it is to get a handle on this. I mean, when you gave your answer, you used if a lot, and I think when you're talking about what might happen in a presidential election, I think that word if is hugely important. Going back to that Scottish referendum on independence, I think what the result of that should have told me, and it probably took me too long to learn the lesson of it, is that just because your world might be saying something, that doesn't mean that the rest of the world is necessarily saying that. And I think in the UK, we went through the Scottish independence referendum. We then in 2016 went through the EU referendum. Now, I was one of those people, even with that lesson of the Scottish referendum, where I was thinking, surely we are not going to vote to leave the EU. That makes no rational sense to me. And no one that I knew, or very few people that I knew, were expressing anything but disdain for the idea that we would ever leave the EU. But then, of course, I live in a privileged part of the UK, high employment rates, high levels of education. The people that I hang around with spend their time in universities and schools. I do not live in a representative sample of the UK. And interestingly, a few weeks before the vote, about 2 weeks before the vote, I took 2 trips to 2 different parts of the UK. I went home to visit some friends, and I went on holiday to a part of the UK. And it was on those journeys where I suddenly saw the posters changing, and farmers' fields filled with leave the EU banners and all that kind of thing. And I suddenly thought, I've got this wrong. The country, the rest of the country doesn't necessarily view this the same way that I do. And I think we just still need to really keep that in mind with Trump in the US. He plays to a section of the US electorate that probably we don't have a good handle on. And whether I know this, it looks like Biden's Democratic nominee. There's still some suggestions, I think, on
$1.10, $1.05, somewhere around there. It might be $1.10.
Yeah, he's obviously got it wrapped up from an electoral college point of view. It's whether there's some kind of a coup, if you like, at the convention. whether Biden is the right guy to take on Trump, I'm doubtful about. I'm not sure it's Bernie Sanders either, incidentally. But I think it's going to be a close run thing, and I won't be getting involved heavily in the election. I think it'll be one to watch and learn from rather than to punt on.
That was really great. Thanks so much for getting up so early and being able to punch us out.